I'm Donna Hassler, Executive Director of Chesterwood, and I'd like to welcome you to the world premiere of Eduardo Montes-Bradley's documentary film, Daniel Chester French, American Sculptor, at the historic Mahawee Theater in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. For over a decade, we have worked hard at Chesterwood, the artist's former home and studio, now a site of the National Trust for Historic Preservation in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, to raise the profile and visibility of Daniel Chester French, who created close to 100 memorials and monuments in the United States and Paris, France. Articles in art journals and newspapers have been published. 3 temporary exhibitions in Concord and Boston, Massachusetts were organized, with another one in progress, not to mention the Lincoln Memorial Illustrated exhibition, now on view at the Norman Rockwell Museum. A definitive biography on the artist was written by Lincoln scholar Harold Holzer, and now a documentary film. This hour-long film was created by an award-winning filmmaker who knew very little about the man behind the monuments, but was excited to learn more through the lens of his camera and drone. I have many people to thank for bringing us to this place tonight. I would first like to thank Chesterwood's staff, Jerry Blash, Margaret Sharon, Erin Glasheen Sheldon, Karen Kenny, Ben Parrott, and our curatorial researcher extraordinaire, Dana Pilson, who deserves a big round of applause, who all had a hand in working with Montes-Bradley in one way or another since last August. I would like to thank all the generous supporters of the film who are listed in your program, especially the executive producer, the Morris and Alma Shapiro Fund, producers Janine Bohr and Louise and Hank Leander, and associate producers Renee and Nancy Buwis, the third, Anita Heller and Elizabeth Pyle, Nancy Sheridan Kojima, in memory of Moonray Kojima, Hans and Kate Morris, Elsie Wilson Thompson, and Jay and Terry Wise. Thank you. I would also like to thank our panelists this evening, Eduardo Montes-Bradley, Harold Holzer, and Thayer Tolles, for joining us for a discussion after the screening, moderated by Michael Bobbit, Executive Director of the Massachusetts Cultural Council. And all of our Centennial event benefactors, Centennial partners, and the Centennial Event Committee. Thank you. And last but certainly not least, the historian Dan Preston, who turned Eduardo Montes-Bradley into one of what we like to call Daniel Chester French groupie. In commemoration of the centennial dedication of the Lincoln Memorial, we are proud to present this documentary film, as well as host a program of activities for families at Chesterwood on Memorial Day, May 30th, from noon to 3 p.m. At this time, I'm very honored to welcome Michael Bobbit to the podium for his keynote remarks about the Lincoln Memorial based on his personal experience having grown up in our nation's capital. Thank you.
Hello, friends. How are you? Are you ready for our world premiere? So exciting. I need them. These are not for fashion. On behalf of Mass Cultural Council, congratulations to Donna and everyone at the Chesterwood and Eduardo for this amazing premiere. What a tremendous way to celebrate the centennial of the Lincoln Memorial. The most profound way that humans will remember the past is through art. And tonight, we get to see art about art, which will magically transport us into the minds and maybe even the hands of this amazing artist, who, as our filmmaker says, lived in the shadows of his art. This film, and the books written, and the curated exhibits, and the work through Donna and her team at Chesterwood, Mr. French is strongly in the sunlight. I am intensely excited because I grew up in Washington, D.C. and visited the memorial dozens and dozens of times. I even got in trouble for jumping into the reflection pool a couple of times. It's not legal to do that. And I also got a chance to be a resident artist at Ford's Theater, so there's a deep connection to Lincoln. But it's Mr. French's profound sculpture that is imprinted on my mind, the scale of it, the massive scale of it. And imagine my awe when I got to visit the Chesterwood with Rex Smitty Pignatelli to see the actual work that was touched by the hand of the artist. And when I walked in facing a certain direction, and I didn't see it. And Donna glides around a corner, and she says, "Well, turn behind you." And I look behind me, and there it is. And of course, I started snapping hundreds of selfies because I had to have it. But that moment reminded me that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and particularly the Berkshires, has some of the nation's most profound, longest-running, historic, premier, largest, celebrated, first, and most notable artists and cultural institutions in the whole entire world. And I need to help you all bring it back out into the sunlight. What a gift artists are to the world. What a gift to generations of people they are. What a privilege it is for organizations to present work by artists. They have the power to reflect and project the world with art. With art. What artists are and what they do is so precious. It should be cherished, heralded, and from my perspective, extremely well funded. Yeah. Tell all your legislators. As I trek across the Commonwealth to visit you and your home on your home turf, please know that I see you and all the work that you're doing, and I also see the need for larger investments. Thank you so much to Donna. Congratulations to Eduardo and everyone at Chesterwood, and also the fact that we get to be here live at the Mahawee Art Center. It's such a special moment. We'll see you afterwards for the panel discussion. Thank you. Also, welcome to the stage. We have Thayer Tolles. Nice to see you. Harold Holzer. Nice to see you. And our director, editor, filmmaker, writer, Eduardo Montes-Bradley. I hope you all will think of questions, because we'll have time to turn the questions out here to the audience. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your work. Thank you. Thank you. So I didn't really properly introduce you, but we have our documentary filmmaker. Harold Holzer is a Lincoln scholar and Daniel Chester French biographer, and Thayer Tolles is the Maritza F. Vilcek. Maritza F. Vilcek, curator of American paintings and sculpture at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So again, thank you for your work, and I'm first interested in why this gentleman and why this topic and why you felt it was important to make this film.
There is a historical reason, I think, and there is a more circumstantial, which is that it was brought to my attention, his existence and the Lincoln Memorial Anniversary, and I started getting curious, and when I get curious, it gets dangerous. And for years I kept a piece of paper in my wallet that read like this: "You walk through a great city, grown old in civilization, one of those containing the most important archives of universal life, and your eyes are drawn upwards, above to the stars, for in the public squares, at the corners of crossroads, motionless characters, taller than those who pass by at their feet, relate to you in a silent language, hide legends of glory, of war, of knowledge, of suffering. Were you the most carefree man, the unhappiest, or the meanest, a beggar or a banker? The stone phantom sizes you for a few instants and orders you, in the name of the past, to think of things which are not of this world. This is the divine role of sculpture. Baudelaire wrote that in 1859. I read it in 1969. And I was the same age that Daniel Chester French was when Baudelaire wrote it. So I thought it was about time for me to capture the magic of the statues.
Artists. Artists. I mean, is it Michelangelo that says, I saw the angel in the marble and I kept carving until I set him free, or something like that? The ability for artists to see something that doesn't exist and then make it happen. That's why I think artists can solve all of the world's problems, right? I'm curious, and if you can take this question on, but as you learn more about Daniel, whether the book or through curating his work at your museum, what surprised you in learning about him? I have a few surprises from the film, but I would love for you to hear from you all.
Thayer says I have to answer first. Well, this is actually relates to Thayer's great work on St. Gaudens, which continues to this day. I was surprised by the ongoing and complex relationship between St. Gaudens, slightly older, and French as friends, frenemies, competitors. When French was about to marry Mary, St. Gaudens said to him, you know, the legs on your Gallaudet statue in Washington, there's something off about them. So he postponed the wedding. And to work on it, and as Mary French later said, I always thank St. Gaudens for making it possible for me to get married in Washington, D.C. in August. That was fun. Maybe it was July, but it was hot. And then St. Gaudens was a frequent critic. And French really cared about what he thought about his work. At the same time, it was St. Gaudens who made it possible for French to be the lead sculptor at the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893, recommending him and really making his reputation. French was the dominant sculptor with this gigantic statue in the lagoon at the World's Columbian Exposition. And then he criticized alma mater a little bit at Columbia. So it was ongoing. When St. Gaudens was to take a life cast of a death mask of William Sherman, he brought French along and said, you do it, it's a little too icky for me. But finally, you know, he didn't want to do it. Finally, and I'll try to do this briefly, at the moment when all these permutations were created so that Bacon becomes the architect, and with an exclusive contract to choose the architect, and he chooses French, and French is the sculptor of the Lincoln Memorial. At the last minute, the government has some cold feet about the cost, and there is a sudden movement to put a replica of St. Gaudens' great Chicago statue of Lincoln, the orator, in the Lincoln Memorial. And it's big, and suddenly French's great dream, his crowning moment, is threatened by the memory of the late St. Gaudens, whose widow comes to Washington to tell Bacon, well, this is what you should do. And I think French must have told Bacon, you better get us out of this, because it was finally rejected and French's dream was fulfilled. So that relationship intrigued me and surprised me. But you know it better than I.
Well, and we'll all learn more as time goes on. But what I think it emphasizes, and what you did so nicely tonight, is the humanity. I mean, I know it sounds silly, but artists are people too. And when I see Daniel Chester French in a film moving, and I mean, I think there's a clip where you can hear his voice, and it's just like, it gives me goosebumps. But of course, we could talk about French and St. Gaudens all night, but we won't. But what I will say is that I think they had the most enormous respect for each other. They were two very different personalities, but they both believed fervently in professionalizing American sculpture in this country and what it said about, even in a larger sense, as America's role as a global power. And of course, as human beings living in the wake of the Civil War, as I mentioned in the film, that just this urge to commemorate and memorialize this terrible war. You know, in my position at the Met overseeing the Historical American Sculpture Collection, I think a lot about these relationships, and what you know, some of you may know is that French, in addition to be well represented in the Met's collection, also was a trustee there for nearly almost 30 years until he died in 1931. And it's just humbling to me to think in some ways he's a predecessor of mine, because he served as de facto curator of the American Sculpture Collection, and he was immensely well liked and well respected in the arts community, and he formed the core of our historical sculpture collection. So when you come to the American wing at the Met and you look around, so many of the sculptures that you see were his, you know, through his connections and his working with artists. So he's much more than just an artist represented in the Met's collection. And so to speak of that humanity and his passion, what did his wife say? It was one of the greatest interests of his life. So it was really full on.
How about you?
I think there is something that came very early on when I started editing the film, and is that I noticed that in America there is a great concern or tendency to individualize the factors, to resort to the persons, to the individuals, sometimes more than to generations and movements. And I could not get my hands or my eyes or my attention out of the fact that French belongs to a group of people larger than himself, a group that excluded many for obvious reasons of the time, of the period, including Piccirilli, for example, which I mentioned in the film. It's interesting that when French proposed to the Lincoln Commission to have the name of the Piccirilli inscribed in the Lincoln Memorial, they say no, although they carved it, right? But the same thing happened with the Art Commission in Virginia, because Piccirilli did Attilio Piccirilli did the bust of Thomas Jefferson, and the commission said that they couldn't have the name of somebody called Piccirilli attached to a monument of Thomas Jefferson. So, time, generation, political experiences, history, weight very heavily in the development of art, not only in America, but elsewhere too, right? So I think that I try to keep in mind constantly the fact that he belonged to a period. Perhaps that's why I resorted to the black and white films in order to try to keep you, as the audience, nailed to the period, and do not abstract yourself from the time in which he lived, because otherwise we end up making mistakes.
I have to just say that I should have said what Thayer said, that it was, to see French moving around in films is pretty thrilling. And the one scene where you have him modeling a horse, which was not his forte, but you know, probably a set-up publicity film, but to see those hands working was extraordinary. I've never seen that.
And also,
Even extending his hand to shake someone's hand.
and what is most incredible and extremely rewarding to me is to hear Thayer say that she thinks she heard him talk. Because that is the magic of films like this, to make you believe that he can talk. It was a silent film, so. But it's incredible that you did. But it was so real. But it was so real that you felt he was talking. And it's true, and that happens. And that means that scene works there.
Great. I want to talk a little bit more about, your point that we have to look at his works through his lens, but, at the same time, especially in curatorial practice, we're trying to introduce our audience to being able to look at works through multiple lenses and to appreciate that everyone brings their own personal experiences and points of view to works of art. And so I think that's really important to think about with French's work, and any, not just historical American art, but any work of art you look at, and I think there are ways that we can go about appreciating French's sculpture in a new dimension. For instance, inviting other people, as you did in this film, people brought their own perspectives to his art, but also, we've done a lot at the Met now in inviting contemporary artists to come into dialogue with historical works, and I think that is a really important way. For instance, what if we commission someone to respond to the Melvin or the Milner Memorial and think about memory and mortality and commemoration? What would happen? I think we'd learn more about these works of art that we've lived with for a long time, but see them anew.
I'm sorry, I thought about that, what you're saying now, in terms of his contemporaries, when I learned that there was a symphonic poem composed by George Chadwick, inspired on the Milner Memorial. I go like, okay, here is art inspiring art, and inspiring me, because I never liked the symphonic poem by Chadwick until I understood why he wrote it, and everything made sense. And I think that end sequence where you see the camera moving back, which is just me walking backwards, and the final bars of the conclusion of that symphonic poem makes a lot of sense to me.
I thought that was several grips and a dolly and a crane. And the drum. I love the picture of seeing his thumb work a piece of clay. That was magic. There were 3 moments in the film that hit me. Not moments. There were 3 things that came out of the film that hit me. One, that his favorite model was a black woman. I'm going to talk about that all the time now. 2. Yeah. 2, the how many of his sculptures that I have touched or seen or passed. There was one in DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C., where I played with my kid and our dog in that fountain like dozens of times. And so that he's like impressed in our lives. He's very much a part of our lives. The other thing that I noticed is that, and I'm not sure we do this nowadays, but how much art and artists were a part of like the design of the country, like the things that we think about as American really are, that are printed on our head, are pieces of art, but how that work was integrated in the work that legislators did and architects did and communities were designed around art. I don't think we've seen that sort of national project since the Federal Arts Project in the 40s or the 50s. But what do you think about that? Like, can we get back to that phase ever again in this country?
Wouldn't that be great?
Wouldn't it be great?
Yeah, it's the 30s, right?
You do remember
the New Deal era, which when they said to FDR, we don't know if the country will accept the idea that you're paying playwrights and cinematographers and artists. He said, well, artists have to eat too. And that's why the Works Progress Administration efforts were extended to artists. Absent that, I think these artists put the foundation in American cities. And I think there is a kind of a renewed interest in public sculpture. Look at the new sculptures in Central Park. The first women have been portrayed, except for Alice in Wonderland and Mother Goose. Real women have been portrayed in Central Park. If we saw...
Mother Goose is not real?
Don't tell your brother. And you show the Eleanor Roosevelt, that wonderful sculpture. So we are seeing it, like something of a renaissance. I don't know if it's not a federal project, but at Hunter College, we're we're working on a commission trying to raise money to do a statue of Audre Lorde, the activist, poet, LGBT, cancer rights activist of the 50s and 60s, who died very young, but who left this extraordinary body of poetry. So the work goes on. I think it's fresh again.
You made a mention to two things that I would like to add to what you said. One is about the image of the United States and the way that, when I was growing up, the image that we had of the United States, graphic image, was Uncle Sam. The men with the reading glasses and the finger. That was the image that was exported as a symbol. Today is the Lincoln Memorial. That changed drastically the way that America is being perceived overseas. Everywhere, from India and Pakistan and Kashmir to South America and Southeast Asia. Uncle Sam is out of the picture. It's the Lincoln Memorial. It's the seated Lincoln of, let me remind you, Daniel Chester French. And another thing that is interesting about the black model, it came to as a revelation to me too, because when I went to see the Sherman Memorial, knowing the Sherman Monument, knowing that the victory was a black woman, which was not passing. She always acknowledged the fact that she was black. And the first thing that I said is, which way are they heading? They were heading south from Fifth Avenue. And where was Sherman going? He was going to Columbia, South Carolina. And where was Hetty Anderson from? Columbia, South Carolina. So she's leading the horse of the liberator by the reins to liberate her city, her town, her country. And I think that the symbolism of that is absolutely extraordinary.
The other thing I love about our panel is that there's this work by this artist, and it has gotten interpreted in several different ways. There's a book about him, there's curation about him, and now there's a film about him. How is it? So how is it sort of working in those different mediums? And at the museum, what do you want people to walk away with after they come in and view the exhibits?
Just on the most fundamental level, I want people to love looking at sculpture up close and really appreciating that it's not at all like looking at a painting or two-dimensional works of art. I kid that it's kind of a participatory act that you need, especially whenever possible, to be able to walk around the objects and experience them in different times of day, different weather, up close, stand back, the lighting, everything is a factor. And in so many monuments, the narrative, if you will, unfolds in the round. And there's just a lot of, we love, everyone's, you see them doing their selfies or their sculptural charades, but really want people to be looking. And nothing is unintentional in, well, you hope at least, in installing sculpture in terms of the relationships between objects. And I just hope that people will go away, at least when they come visit the Met, with a newfound appreciation for sculpture and for the lives of sculpture, if you will, because I think, what is so brilliant about the Lincoln Memorial or the St. Gaudens Shaw 54th in Boston, these are sculptures that have had many lives and mean a lot to a lot of different people, and those are the best sculptures.
I'd love to turn to the audience. We have something in common. There is a book by Robert McCloskey called Make Way for Ducklings. Do you all know that book? Right? With that, so there's a book by an artist. That book was turned into a sculpture, right? And then performance art. And I'm writing, my play, Make Way for Ducklings, is premiering in Boston next year. So, a little fun. Questions out here? Question from anyone? I think we have someone with the microphone's gonna run around. Can't see your hands. Oh, we got one?
No, microphone.
Oh, microphone. No questions? Oh, here's one over here. There we go.
I was very interested at the end that you took this sculpture memorializing the president and what he did 150 years ago and brought it into the present and ended with scenes of protests launched from the memorial. And I wonder how you decided to connect it to the current time that way.
Well, that's what makes that work immortal, is the permanent, constant, ongoing dialogue between history, past and present. And I think that Mr. Sherman said it very clearly when he says that the difference between a basilical dialogue in which the ceremony with the people takes place inside the building, in the case of the Lincoln Memorial, and it takes place between the inside and the outside. And that's why I believe, and I think that I'm sure that Harold will agree too, that it is the shrine of secular democracy. And that's what makes that monument so extraordinary. And I can add that the first demonstration ever made in front of the Lincoln Memorial was by the KKK. I just didn't think that I should mention it on the film.
You know, it didn't evolve into a platform for a more aspirational change. It took 17 years from the time of the dedication, and it only happened because the Daughters of the American Revolution would not allow Marian Anderson to sing at Constitution Hall because black performers were barred from the space. It's within walking distance of the memorial. So Eleanor Roosevelt and Harold Ickes and Walter White also, who was in the Roosevelt administration, arranged for her to sing at the Lincoln Memorial, and that changed everything. By 1947, Harry Truman was addressing the NAACP from the steps of the memorial, Dr. King in 1963. And there's still some demonstrations there that I would love to not give permits to. But it is an open space and it's used as a protest and aspirational space to this day, which is great.
And with regards to your question concerning the difference between the three concerns, biographical, written biography, the curatorial experience, and the film, I think they coexist in the dialectical work in which they one feed from the other. I could not have made this film without Thayer's support and help. I could not have made this film if it wasn't that Harold took the trouble to write an extraordinary biography on the subject. And hopefully, what my film will do is inspire others to work in a similar fashion with what has been done. You don't need to destroy necessarily the past in order to read on it again. And yes, so thank you very much for the book, and thank you very much for your support.
Well, thank you. And I would like to say that, you know, I'm someone who thinks about historic American sculpture a lot, like 24/7, almost, but not quite. But what I want to say is there is a tremendous amount of archival material for Daniel Chester French, and of course all his sculptures. And what you have both done so magnificently is come from a different perspective. So you as through the lens of a Civil War historian and biographer, you as a filmmaker, and you've brought a fresh perspectives that allow us to see this artist that, you know, we could say we thought we knew, but now we know in a totally different, expanded way. So that's really exciting.
Could I make one point that hasn't been made on this stage? My 1962 visit to the Lincoln Memorial was important, but what really made me interested in this subject was a 1971 visit. My wife and I came up here, 72, to meet Stephen Laurent, a great Lincoln scholar, a photojournalist who lived in Lenox, a presidential historian, and he asked us if we'd ever seen Chesterwood. We hadn't, and he drove us there at about 85 miles an hour and showed us the studio. I don't even know if there was a curator there. He just waltzed in and showed us the array of sculptures, and he said, "Do you see that sculpture in the corner? what do you think of that one? And we said, well, it looks kind of like you. He said, it was my French's daughter. She sculpted me. And that was my introduction. It's possible that any of you here has not seen Chesterwood. You will understand why French said, I work for 6 months of the year in New York City and 6 months in heaven. That place means a lot as well. So curatorship, biography, film, but also a sense of place as an inspiration.
And like you said, that Lincoln lived in many different places, but he lives in the Lincoln Memorial. Well, not just the French lived in many places, but he lives in Chesterwood.
Indeed.
You can find his presence in ever-changing New York City because they're not there. I actually infiltrated these studios and places at a very high cost, personal. But he lives in Chesterwood. That's where you can go and just sit down inside the studio, which I intentionally did not show inside, to leave that as a revelation for you to go sit down and experience it yourselves.
Yes, I think good question. Great.
You very carefully stated that it was important to understand him in the period of time that he did his work. And I'm wondering what as professionals, we think about what's going on now when we're looking at statues that were made many years ago that are being torn down, that were done at a different time. They weren't his statues and maybe of that stature, but I just wonder about what you think about that movement.
Yeah, well, I'll start. I must say I've evolved on it. I was pained at first to see that there was no effort to create context at some of these disputed sites. I thought the Mercier statue of Lee was kind of a beautiful work. But I have come around on it, on the subject, even before they were taken down in Richmond. There really should be no statues, in my view, in a public square that commemorate traitors to the Republic. And that's what those Confederate monuments, many of them built in the Jim Crow era, represented. But there is a gray area. A replica was taken down by the mayor of Boston that had stood there for more than 125 years. The statue in Washington, in Lincoln Park, though it was dedicated by Frederick Douglass and unveiled by Ulysses S. Grant, there are many people calling for it to be removed because it shows either a kneeling or a rising slave responding to the great emancipator's outstretched hand. It's dated in its iconography. But again, reading Douglass's tribute, he thought it should stand and remain. So it's complicated.
I think that they should leave the horses alone. I live in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I had a movement, presided over a movement, and a board of only one person, which was me. When I went to Andrea Douglas from the Thomas Jefferson African American History Center, and I go like, Andrea, it's okay, take Lee with you, leave the horse. Because the horse first wasn't being paid, he was enslaved, he was oppressed. I don't necessarily think he was treated fair either. And it would be left as a symbol to ask for people to come in the future and say, who was on that horse? Okay, let me tell you. And then you tell what do you think? Lee was all about a traitor to the Republic. But leave the horse, don't touch the horse.
You know, the horse was a very famous Confederate. Lee's horse
Yes.
was almost as famous as Lee Travis.
It's true. But
So
he
be
didn't have a
careful there.
choice. He didn't have a choice. Nobody asked him, Traveler. The name of the horse was Traveler. They called, I don't know, they could sell him, they buy him, you know, do whatever they want with them. So he did not have a choice, so long live the horses.
Yeah. It's a very good question. It's a very layered and gray area question, and I certainly have my own opinions about it. One more question. One more question.
Not about horses.
Well, I like this.
The mic is coming.
I like the section very much on the surface quality of Daniel Chester French's female nudes, his interest in studying the female nude. And I wonder if you could talk about his respect for women sculptors of his generation, and if he collaborated with them.
Thanks, Joel, for lobbing that one at us. You know, and this is another sort of St. Gaudens French parallel in terms of they're just really wanting to pay it forward in mentoring a younger generation of sculptors, and particularly women, and oftentimes just on the same terms as their male sculptors. So they both, for instance, taught at the Art Students League. They both took women assistants into their studios, and I feel when I tell people that a sculptor studio is sort of like a dentist's office, that everyone has their job, and there's the dentist, and then there's the sculptor, and then there are all the assistants. It's kind of like, that's the business model. But French himself had a very close relationship as a mentor to a woman named Evelyn Longman, who for many years, not only was an assistant, but became a close personal friend of the French family, and had a distinguished career in her own right, both as a monumental sculptor, which was less common for women artists, but also at small bronzes. And here's an example at French kicking into action as a trustee at the Met. I think something like 5 of her works were acquired during the, almost 30 years that he was a trustee. So he and further to that point, and of French and women artists, where a lot of museums are actively trying to acquire works by women artists, and of course I am as a sculpture curator, but French laid the groundwork. There are many sculptures by women artists in the American Wing collection that have been in the collection for well over 100 years, and that is all credit to Daniel Chester French.
On the subject of Longman, by the way, since we're 3 days from the centennial of the Lincoln Memorial, you can see her work because French made sure she was part of the project. So she did some of the decorative elements surrounding the incised text of the Gettysburg Address and the second inaugural. And I think at one point when French was a little bit uncertain about moving the legs of his statue, he wrote a letter to her saying, I really would like your company, not only because you're so lovely, but because I really need your advice. I mean, he had to throw that one part in, and she came up to Chesterwood and advised him. He really depended on her, and the evidence of that mentorship is in the Lincoln Memorial.
Well, one of our next projects is about the American Renaissance, and the idea would be to expand the canon of men to include women. And I'm fascinated with this American sculptor that was partly African American, partly Native American, Edmonia Lewis, who did very well in Italy and died in London. And if you can tell us something.
Recently did we learn the date of her death and where she's buried. So there's a lot of scholarly attention on Edmonia Lewis.
She should be part of the canon as well?
Absolutely.
Well, that's the whole idea. I think that the next film should be about a broader canon that would include women, African American, and, well, in this case of this extraordinary sculptor, the fact that she was half Native American, half African American makes it even more interesting to know more about it.
What I would say to you is please do, because American sculpture scholarship has been very monographic and siloed, so that the more we can bring these artists into dialogue is that both in a scholarly but also more popular way is a huge contribution.
You can bet on it.
I agree. It's not America without women and black people. All right. I hope you have gone to the Chesterwood, and if you haven't, get there soon, if only to see the different iterations of the Lincoln statue, and especially the mini, which leads with the left foot and has two clenched fists and eyes looking down, to the 6-foot version where the right hand is looser and it leads with the right foot and the eyes are squinted and looking out towards the horizon. It's worth a visit. I hope you also make donations to the Chesterwood. I also hope you will buy tickets to every single production here at the Mahawee Performing Arts Center and make contributions as well. I hope you will go to Washington, D.C. and step into the Lincoln Memorial and let your heart go into your throat, because it is a magnificent experience. I thank you. Buy the book, go to the Met, and watch the film again. Big hand.